So, Berto, a lot of people have been asking us to talk about Puff Daddy or Diddy or Sean Combs and his crimes.
Oh.
So let's get into it. What do you say?
Let's do it.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast and YouTube channel, and my name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor, and my dog is barking. Who are you, Berto?
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I add wheels to small robots.
So let's get into it. I thought that this episode would be a short one, but after doing a bit of a deep dive on all the information that I could get my hands on, I think there are some avenues of analysis and discussion that go beyond the headlines that we can get into in this series. I don't know how many chapters this is going to be, but hopefully it won't be too many chapters. The first thing we need to talk about is who is P. Diddy or who is Sean Combs. For some people out there, they might not really be that familiar with his career. Other people might be very intimate with his career, meaning they might really know his career very well. But let's comb through it. So he initially became famous in the mid-1990s. He was famous for being the founder of the music label Bad Boy Records. Bad Boy Records launched many big names in early hip-hop. Over the span of his career, he launched or helped launch several major artists, including Biggie, Mary J. Blige, Janelle Monáe, Machine Gun Kelly, which I didn't realize, Lil' Kim, Faith Evans, Cassie, of course, Shine, Mace, 112, Craig Mack, Black Rob, G-Dep, which I've never heard. Have you ever heard of G-Dep?
No, I have not.
Day 26, Donnie Klang, which I haven't heard of, French Montana, The Lox, Boys in the Hood, and many, many more. Also, as a solo artist, he sold millions of records. He won 3 Grammys, including Best Rap Album for his, I think it was his first album, No Way Out, in 1997. In the late 90s and early 2000s, he was one of the most famous people in the world.
Yeah.
He was everywhere. He was well known for his lavish parties. Some of his parties were called white parties, where everyone dressed in white and all the accoutrement at the party was white, white curtains and white plates and white fancy things.
And he looked cool. He was a tastemaker. Every time he showed up on MTV, first of all, he made appearances in all his videos, all the videos of his artists. Like, I remember first seeing him more as like on Mace videos and things like that. And every time he showed up, he's all like super well dressed. He had his little butler guy next to him, and it just looked like, oh, wow, this guy knows what's up.
Yeah, he was really good at that kind of, I don't know what you call it, image making. The lavish parties were known for having a lot of celebrities. And also there was talk and rumors and also confirmation of sex, drugs, and rock and roll happening at these parties, nakedness and other kinds of things. He was a little less well known for his sex parties, which were called freak-offs. Do you remember hearing about the freak-offs back then?
I do not. I definitely remember the white parties, and it's not even about remembering. Of course, anyone would have guessed that, oh, wow, crazy wild stuff I'm sure goes on at his parties. And if someone had said, well, do you know he's got a room where they do even crazier things? I would have been like, well, of course he does. But I never heard of like freak-offs, and I certainly never heard of anything beyond that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was wondering because...
Did you hear it?
Well, so I should be upfront and say that I'm an alternative rock guy.
Right.
And at the time in the 90s, it was the case that people my age anyway, if you were in the alternative rock world, you didn't really know anything about not only hip hop world, but also just top 40 in general. So I was not aware. I wasn't in that circle. I wasn't consuming that kind of news, or it certainly wasn't talked about among my friends. I graduated high school in 1989 as hip hop was just kind of getting going in terms of top 40 stuff. And once I was in college, I didn't even listen to the radio. It was all just
whatever you
it was
bought.
College stuff, and it was, and I was in a band in Seattle, grunge and all that kind of stuff, and so hip hop, I was aware of it, but it was very distant to me. So I in researching this deep dive, I learned a lot.
I can imagine. Look, I didn't know much about hip hop either in the 90s.
So for those that are watching this and know all of this culture and the history and the details, I want to apologize for being an outsider to this world. and it will probably be realized. I'm a musician myself, and so I am maybe more aware of that angle of things, and
Sure.
I was alive at the time, but I don't remember experiencing much about the culture, so I should just be upfront. Anyway, so Sean Combs is also I'm going to call him Sean Combs, by the way. It feels kind of silly to call him by his nicknames.
Especially given the circumstances.
Exactly.
I like it. Sean Combs it is.
Or just Sean,
Yeah.
So Sean Combs also is famous for creating the Sean John clothing line. I believe his middle name is John, so it's literally just his name. And it was a huge clothing line, and a lot of people try to start a clothing line, and only some managed to be huge, and his was huge. He was also on the MTV show Making the Band, which is a show about making a vocal group. I think Day 26 is actually a band that was formed on Making the Band. He was the main figure on the show. He was like the Donald Trump of The Apprentice. He would make or break careers and say, like, you're good to go into the group, and you're not good to go into the group, that kind of stuff.
I'm pretty sure I watched some of that show.
Well, he also became a successful entrepreneur. He invested a lot of money into various different things, including Ciroc vodka. Is that how you pronounce it? Ciroc?
I don't know.
He also launched the Revolt TV network, which I'd never heard of, but apparently it's a big deal. Forbes named him as one of the wealthiest hip-hop artists several times, in several different issues of Forbes. He was named as one of the wealthiest hip-hop artists in the world. So that's what he's known for. That's a pretty quick summary of what he's famous for people that might not know him. So before getting into the deep dive, I want to provide some caveats. One is a major trigger warning because he is being accused of committing horrific crimes of rape of men and women, and also minors, even children. I'm not going to give a lot of details, but some details are necessary, I think, in order to really understand what we're dealing with here. So, trigger warning there. I'm also going to be using the word rape. Sometimes sexual assault is more appropriate, more descriptive of the situation, but sometimes the word rape is exactly what it is, and I'm not going to tiptoe around it, and I'm not a fan of people tiptoeing around it. I think it is a way of infantilizing the audience in some way. It also, I think, just furthers the stigma, as if it's like the word Voldemort or something. It's like you must not say that word when it's real. Like, we don't censor the word murder. We can say so-and-so was murdered, but you can't say the R word as what the algo speak will dictate, which I'm just not a fan of. What harm is it for adults to be talking about adult things? Now, children should not be watching our content.
Right.
And parents need to monitor what their children are watching.
Yeah, but it's the same thing. Like, if we're talking, like you make an excellent point. We could sit here and say, like, oh, that person was decapitated. That person was stabbed, like whatever, any number of violent things. But if you say rape, now you can't.
Yeah. And I think it's just another manifestation of our stigma around it and our fear of acknowledging that it exists. The other caveat that I want to disclose is I want to talk about the data that I'm going to present. There's a lot of data out there on the internet. There's a lot of rumor. There's a lot of speculation. And I'm really attempting to provide information that is confirmed from good journalism, quality journalists, quality news outlets, that kind of thing. And it should also be acknowledged that I don't have any firsthand information. It's all just things that I can find in the internet. There is some room for speculation, but I will couch it as speculative. Also, we should acknowledge that this is the United States, where people are innocent until proven guilty. There is a chance that the allegations are false. It doesn't seem likely, but it is possible. We'll find out in the future how the legal case pans out in the courts. So I just want to say that up front. I'm not a journalist, so I don't know all the procedures in terms of making sure to always talk about this is alleged and, blah, blah, blah. But I'm going to try. So I just want to say that up front, that everything that I am reporting on, everything that I'm talking about is from the internet, and it's all alleged at this point. That isn't to say that we can't make some educated guesses as to what actually happened, which I will be doing. All right, so what are the allegations exactly? I want to summarize those before we go into the chronological history. But before we do that, let's take a break. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right, we're back from the break. So what are the allegations exactly? I'm guessing most of y'all have heard at least the headlines, but I think it's important to get into the specifics. So the charges, the federal charges, were submitted in September of 2024, and he was charged with sex trafficking and racketeering. Berto, what is sex trafficking and racketeering?
Well, I know what sex trafficking is. It's when you move a human with the intent to, have them commit illegal sex acts. So, maybe you
actually, yeah, that's my guess as well, because trafficking sounds like because typically you're thinking you're taking people from Southeast Asia or something, and
from one state to another or something.
Yeah, but the definition that I found is that it's coercing individuals into sexual activities against their will.
Oh, the trafficking is more like drug trafficking. Like it's all of the activities related to it.
I guess, yeah. So it's important to have that definition, is that sex trafficking, in terms of the legal definition that I found, it's
coercing.
It's forcing people essentially into sex work.
Okay.
And you don't necessarily move them.
I see.
But you might. But you might move them as a part of trying to get more control or
so
get
the moving is ancillary. It's the coercion.
Right. What about racketeering?
So racketeering, I thought it had to do with like a plot with others to essentially, the mob might be indicted for racketeering, but I don't know the details. That one I'm less familiar with.
Yeah, right. I always associate racketeering with the mob. And the definition that I found is that it's operating a criminal enterprise that is engaged in various illegal activities over a span of time. So the classic, I think, example is when you're trying to convict someone like Al Capone, but he isn't directly involved in any of the fraud or the murder or the violence. It's an organized group that is committing a lot of crimes.
It always sounds so old-timey to me, like, hey, you're involved in a racket, see? You gotta be indicted on racketeering.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting, right? But it does fit, because when we get into the details, it'll be apparent. Now, the criminal enterprise that he's being accused of is mostly involved in the sex trafficking, raping individuals, drugging individuals, sexual harassment in the workplace, filming sexual acts without consent, showing those video clips without consent, which is commonly referred to as revenge porn, and also assaulting children. And it was an organization. It wasn't just him doing these individual things like Harvey Weinstein. It was a group of people, paid employees and friends and family members, which we'll get into, that are allegedly involved in an effort to rape, drug, and sex traffic and coerce people into sex acts. But also there are allegations of intimidation of victims, physical assaults, and maybe even possibly murder, which we'll get into. So do you know how many people have come forward so far accusing Sean Combs of sexual crimes?
I don't know the number. Maybe 10?
150.
No way.
Yeah.
That have come to the authorities, or like...
That have come to the lawyers that are heading...
150.
Yeah. And it keeps growing.
Okay. I mean, I knew, so like from everything I've seen, I know that the numbers are in the hundreds that are potentially, if it were all true, or if 10% of it is true, there's definitely hundreds of people affected. I didn't know that many people came forward.
Right. Now,
that's amazing.
Some of the individuals are coming forward anonymously, but legal experts that I've heard will say that once the feds start to investigate, they're not going to allow people to just sue from afar, because that's one of the ways that victims can be protected, is that they can sue and settle without having to put their name out there to incur the consequences from society. At least that's my understanding. But there are a lot of people who have come forward on the record, which we'll get into. So yeah, over 150 individuals so far have come forward alleging that Sean Combs sexually assaulted them. And it's important to point out that this is men and women. Yeah. This is not just rape of women. There's a fair amount of men, and it's possible that there's an equal amount, if not a greater amount, of male victims, which is, I think, an important part of the story to highlight.
Yeah.
Also, some individuals who were children at the time, who were minors, teenagers or younger, I think as young as like 9 years old or something, they were victimized as minors. There's also, regarding the racketeering aspect of it, there's probably dozens, if not hundreds, of criminals involved, perpetrators involved in this. It's sort of like the Jeffrey Epstein situation. Other people have been named. Famous people have been named as well, and not famous people. Do you know some of the famous people that have been named?
Yeah, I mean, so there's the anything from like Jay-Z, Beyonce even, but and then it's got like Will Smith, I guess, and even Denzel at some point, like a lot of big names.
Well, I think that those are just speculative.
Totally, yeah.
But Jay-Z has specifically been named.
Yeah, one of the underage accusers accused both of them. I knew that.
Yeah.
But I'm saying like...
And the Beyonce thing is speculative because in the lawsuit, it names Jay-Z and Sean Combs and a famous unnamed woman. So people think that's Beyonce, but that Beyonce's name has not been identified.
Right. So you're right. That's like that. But then the rumors swirling around people that participate in freak-offs, it's got like tons and tons of names.
Right. But
and it's all
that's
like,
really speculative. Yeah. It's like, oh, so-and-so went to one of his parties. Right. I mean, who knows? Yeah. I mean, could be. But Jay-Z's been specifically identified by an alleged victim. Also, Cuba Gooding Jr. Has been specifically identified. Yeah. So there's that. Also, the several employees of Sean Combs, bodyguards, associates, many of whom have been named as well. But the number of people who have, you alluded to this earlier, that, okay, sure, you have X number of people who have come forward, but usually that's just a small percentage of the number of victims out there, right? So why would that be? Why would someone, let's say that only 10%, research shows that about 10%-ish people will come forward. But that's a really rough number, and it really just depends on the situation, because that percentage is based on people who report crimes of perpetrators that aren't famous or powerful, right? If you have a famous, powerful perpetrator, I would imagine that the likelihood of people coming forward would be even lower. I mean, he can easily crush you legally. He can ruin your career. He could ruin your life. All of his fans will come after you. And you would not be delusional to think that he could kill you or hurt you somehow physically, right?
In some of the accounts, one of the ex-girlfriends of his talks about what it's like to have a billionaire who is after you, like when you're going up against a billionaire, what that means, right? Like the unlimited resources they have to mess with your life. So there's that. Also, a lot of the people might have their name, they don't want to tarnish their name because they're now, someone in the industry, and this might have been, how they got started, or they got whatever. They might owe favors, all of these things. The other thing is, unfortunately, not all, of course, but some of the victims might have then gotten involved in victimizing others, and then maybe they're afraid of that too. So there's all sorts of reasons why.
Right. They might have been coerced into doing it, or they might have been bystanders and are worried that they'll be implicated as a perpetrator. I mean, who knows? But yeah, so the main categories that are identified as reasons why people will not report are fear of retaliation, as you mentioned, losing a job, losing your social standing, losing your sense of safety, losing your life, right? Also, another category is shame and stigma around victims. You and I and the people that we hang out with don't carry at least the typical amount of stigma around someone being identified as a victim of this kind of crime. But most people in the world and in our society, unfortunately, still have the old school, traditional, ridiculous notion that if you've been victimized, then that makes you a slut or dirty or tainted, or you must have been asking for it, or why were you there in the first place? You must be weak or stupid, or you're just dirty now, or something like that. It's really stupid.
Absolutely. And I hate to say it, but a lot of the guys that were victimized, they operate in a culture where it's actually still not okay to be homosexual. And even if it's somewhat okay for other people, it's not okay for them. And they were probably afraid that by saying that they were victimized by a man, that impugns their masculinity in some way.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would imagine that even enlightened people have a theme of that in their reactivity to other victims coming forward along these lines. And it's just the whole thing. Yeah. And what if they were gay, or bisexual? Like, what does that matter? So it's
like
really
you're saying,
unfortunate.
like, us being more enlightened or whatever. I gotta say, like, I've been victimized when I was a kid, but if I had been victimized as an adult at work, I'd like to think that I'd be able to open up and all these things, but it might be very difficult.
Yeah.
Just like, because you would feel all these, like, even though it's totally unwarranted, you'd feel like shame, like, oh, I was victimized at work, it's like, and you'd have to deal with all that. I don't know how I would react. So it's very easy to say, oh, everyone should always feel totally comfortable with reporting everything. But
what is that feeling? You're like,
because, okay, just the thought that you go to a place that you're supposed to be safe, and all of a sudden you are put in a situation where you feel complete powerlessness, and you have this now thing where it's been done to you, and coming out with it will change everything. All the dynamic about your work, the way that people see you at work. And again, in a beautiful world, it would only be great, right? Like, oh my gosh, you came forward. Bravo. We all respect you so much more. But internally, I could imagine a lot of feelings of like, how would people react? What will they say about me? Well, all these fears.
Well, what would the worry be that people would say about you?
They might not believe me. They might think that I'm trying to actually get the other person because I'm backstabbing them at work or something. It might be a thing where I'm exaggerating, or I'm being too sensitive, or I don't know.
Yeah. But also that you would be emasculated is one way that people would see it.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
You're not a real man if you let that happen to you.
Yeah.
A real man wouldn't let that happen. Real men victimize. They don't become victims.
In fact, this happened to Terry Crews, that huge dude.
I was thinking about him.
Yeah, he's like, I was sexually abused. And people are like, come on, man.
Yeah.
Get out of here. You?
Yeah.
Can't.
Well, and one could say that he might have felt more comfortable coming forward because his masculinity is not in question.
Yeah.
In terms of traditional aspects of
and
masculinity.
And yet it was still questioned. It was so dumb.
But imagine if he were not so identified as the embodiment of a certain aspect of masculinity, like it might be harder, right? Also, there's reasons for victims to distrust the system, whether at work or with the criminal justice system, to effectively and sensitively react if you were to come forward, right? So there's that. The system might accuse you of having asked for it, or you're not telling the truth because your story isn't consistent, because you're trying to piece together. You were drugged, for example.
Like, what was that show we talked about a while ago that took place in Seattle?
Unbelievable.
Unbelievable, yeah.
Yeah, it's a true story that's depicted in that series, and it depicts that really well. You had these two cops that were well-meaning, but they just didn't understand the syndrome that victims of rape will be in, and started to find inconsistencies with the story because the victim was this young person and they don't have a lawyer, and they're just like, I'm just trying to remember. And they started to press her for information, and she's just like, I don't know, I guess maybe. And then they forced her basically to say that she had lied about the whole thing when she hadn't lied. And then these other two cops come later, and they are more sensitive, women cops, by the way, and managed to actually get her trust, even though the previous cops had harmed her in that way. So, there's a lot of viable reasons that victims would not want to come forward, because the justice system can, at the very least, be discounting and can even re-traumatize. There are these stories of people coming forward, and I think this was depicted in that series, I'm not sure, that they will submit the victims to an extremely invasive examination of their body that can be very violating and intrusive, and it can also be traumatizing to the individual.
And remember, even just the retelling of it, because they were asked to tell it over, and then the other person would come in, okay, start from the beginning. And that's crazy.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Why not? Record it. Just record it.
Yeah. But they do that because they're trying to catch you, right? Because they assume you're not telling the truth. Anyway. Another reason why people don't come forward is because they, for reasons of society or for reasons of their upbringing, they might minimize what they went through as something that doesn't really count as being sexually assaulted or rape. Oh, because there's a certain stereotype or typical story that people will think of when they think of rape, like a person jumping out of the bushes and raping someone. But the vast majority of sexual assaults do not look like that, right? So some people will minimize it.
Look, if I rewind the clock, let's say, I don't know, 20 years ago, if I had been sexually assaulted, let's say I go into a woman's office and she's like, close the door, okay, and then she, maybe she's in a position of authority, she's like, proceeds to like try to kiss me, grab me, whatever. I am fairly certain that, and assuming I don't go along with it, but I'm fairly certain that in my mind I would have been like, well, that's weird, but these things do happen. Like, it just be like, I would just write it off. Right. I might tell someone as in like, you won't believe what happened to me.
Yeah. Right. Because for a lot of people, if you're a man, you're not capable of being victimized like that. It's just definitionally not included. So, so there's a lot of reasons why people will not report. And that's what results in the research finding that only 10% actually come forward. I would speculate that an even lower percentage would come forward with a perpetrator like Sean Combs because of the power, not only just his resources and money that he could bring to bear to destroy you legally, but also a lot of the victims were people that were attempting to enter into the industry, and they could easily believe, or there were times when allegedly Sean Combs would literally just say this, your career will be over if you talk about this or something. So there's a lot of reasons. So I would contend that a very small percentage have come forward thus far. So with 150, and then you times it. But I actually spent some time looking at the research and thinking about the other cases like this to get an idea of an estimated victim count, not as a morbid exercise, but I think as an important exercise of putting things in perspective and understanding just how horrific this is. And I also went through like 30 different other famous perpetrators, people like Harvey Weinstein and Larry Nassar and this sort of thing, Bill Cosby, and did the same thing where I looked at the number of people who came forward and went on the record and said that the individual had harmed them sexually, and counted all those individuals and then tried to estimate. So I actually made a list of the ranking of like who has victimized the most in all likelihood, or speculating how, the total number. And I want to present that list because it's interesting, to go through the Jeffrey Epsteins and the Harvey Weinsteins and the Bill Cosbys and the R. Kellys, and also for Sean Combs. But let's take a break. And after the break, we'll go through that list, but it'll just be for patrons of the podcast. So if you want to hear that, then become a patron on Patreon, and you'll get access to this full episode and all of this series. Every chapter will have a free section and then a patron section to reward the patrons for literally paying my bills and giving me the time to be able to do this. Otherwise, please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.